All right, welcome to this video in which we are going to look at a paper I presented at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University, Rabat, Morocco, on 18th November 2024. And this paper was actually published in Peace and Conflict journal, and the title is Colonialism and Mimicry. Literally lends into governance in Africa. So we want to see the representations of governance through selected works of African literature. And we are going to see what these writers suggest about the type of governance that we need in Africa. So let's move to the first slide, which is on introduction. So poor governance pervades thematic concerns among African literary writers. Writers have really grappled with the poor governance in Africa because politics matters a lot. As scholars argue, politics is actually a branch of society that deals with distribution of values, and these values could be education, economic values, it could be democratic freedoms, and these values matter a lot. So poor politics basically means poor governance to the people concerned. So neocolonialism has been an extension of colonial culture and is the major cause of poor governance. That is Ozigwe 2019, Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Aiko Yama, Francis Mbuga, Nurdin Farah, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o have all delved into themes of poor governance in Africa. Ngugi in 1980, for example, considers the new leaders as mere black versions of white colonizers. That is a devil on the cross. What we are saying is that the advent of Western democracy has not mitigated poor governance in Africa as the leaders mobilize along ethnic lines by rigging elections. Abubakar Ba, 2004, describes these new African governments as quasi-democracies that exhibit want of ideology, accentuate corruption, and intimidate the opposition to rig elections. We have seen like elections in Uganda where opposition is intimidated. Look at what's happening in Tanzania today, where the opposition leader is accused of trumped-up charges and detained. So democracy, Western democracy, has not really worked for most African governments. So are pristine Western political systems a prescription to African governance issues? When you talk about Western democracy the way it is it really a solution to governance problems in Africa? Rodney 2018 argues that the West is a cause of the disruption of African civilization, because it introduced values that changed and disrupted her evolution. According to Rodney, if Africa had been left to evolve on its own, it would have come up with a system of governance better suited to the African situation. Through colonialism, Rodney argues that there was interference in the evolution. There was interference in the evolution of African civilization, and that disruption is what has caused the kind of stagnation we have politically in Africa today. For Rodney, development in the African perspectives included moral values. For example, honesty, contentment, and generosity. So for Africa, development was not just the material package, but it entailed values such as honesty, contentment, and generosity. The arts, religious beliefs, and political structures in which African people excelled. So development was not just the material. For Africa, development also involves the immaterial, which is the political structures, the religious values, and the arts. John Mbiti argues that the interdependence between the individual and society was central in the African cosmology. or in the African philosophy, yeah, that the individual had to mature, had to grow, while connected to society, ancestors, and their family. And so it was more of holistic development than just one which was narrowed towards material development that we see in most Western cultures today. So the sudden change to Western material values like rationality, the modern state, and imperialism marked a regression, forcing Africans to start from the basics in the new culture. Sarah Marty 2017 argues that imitation is a learning strategy among young siblings. Yeah? And therefore, what we see in Africa today is just an imitation of Western political structures, an imitation of Western philosophy or Western thinking, which is typical of toddlers. So this study contends that Western interference during colonialism bolstered imitation or mimicry, which turned out to be the prime cause of poor governance in Africa today. I argue that if Africa had been left to evolve on its own, it would have come up with a more suitable form of government, or its own African democracy. Mandela talks about African democracy, which was based on consensus rather than the current one based on the vote. And the vote basically signifies dichotomies or what we call binarism. Competition between two sides, which is not an element of African democracy. So the texts that we focused on in this particular paper are the Bidfans Are Not Yet Born from West Africa, David Mulwa's Inheritance from East Africa, and Chikwava's Harare North from Southern Africa. Collectively, these works suggest that there is a nexus between poor governance in Africa and imitation of Western cultural, political, and economic systems. Had the colonists left Africans to advance their political thought and values as Rudney submits, they would possibly have a political system that works for them than the current one based on imitation. The three texts espouse honest living, concern for others, and contentment as African values. Where mass Bitfans are not yet born, espouses unity and diversity in diversity, the sanctity for ancestral homelands in Chikwava's Harare North, and humility and contentment, and even spirituality in Mulwa's Inheritance. The latter in particular underlines the need for an Africanized political system of government. So this is the picture of Aikwaya Ma from West Africa. That's the title. The Bidfans Are Not Yet Born. And then David Mulwa as the picture of David Mulwa from East Africa and the Inheritance. And then this is Chikwava and his title Harare North. Let's look at the theoretical framework. So this paper is based on the works of Homi Bhabha, 1984, who comes up with the concept of mimicry. According to Bhabha, mimicry constitutes the colonized adoption of the colonized culture with a view of establishing a reformed and recognizable other. So basically, you become a reformed and recognizable other. The colonized strives to please the colonizer in an ambivalent fashion that leads to confusion. So as we try to imitate the colonizer, we become confused because we are neither here nor here. Ambivalence is where you have a love and hate, a love and hate for something. So basically, you exist in a state of conflict, in a state of conflict, and this is what Bhabha calls confusion. The victim is reformed because they abandoned their philosophy and are controlled and regulated. So basically, Africa in our state, if we apply these theories, that we are just a reformed kind of people who have abandoned our own our own political structures. So we are only reformed because in the eyes of the original or owner of the culture, we are reformed from our culture, which the colonizer hates. So they lack a clear identity, exhibiting a contradiction in which they adopt just enough of the new form to be recognized by the colonizer while representing the form in excess. So even if we try, even if we try to say that we are adopting Western culture or Western democracy, we are only imitating. There is no way our democracy will be better than the US democracy or the or European democracy. We are only trying to imitate, what is there. So the tenets of this theory were essential in interrogating the possibility of African leaders practicing as severe forms of colonial rule after independence. Because we are only imitating, at sometimes we execute the scripts even better. Since post-colonialism arose after the clash of cultures, So this is the picture of Homi Baba. This is the picture of Homi Baba. Let's now continue. So let's look at mimicry. Let's look at Ghana. So scholars observe that colonial Ghana exhibited social stratification, particularly between regions with the large-scale cocoa plantations and those that only supplied labor. That is Young 2018. European government officials had started large-scale cocoa farms and all that. And that's why when now Kwame Nkrumah took over, he wanted to end this class structure in Ghana. That colonialism had established classes in Ghana. So at the top, there were European government officials. That was the top of the class structure. And then there were government employees who were skilled workers and miners and all that. And the bold contends that these inequalities became glaring in the 1930s. So when Kwame Nkrumah now takes over, he wanted to end this class structure. Now, in the Bitfans are not yet born, the writer reveals that these classes were very pronounced in Nkrumah's era. Of course, those who know, the writer Aikweyama was actually a classmate to Kwame Nkrumah, and he knew a lot about Nkrumah. And even as he writes this book, he has a background of the kind of person Kwame Nkrumah was. And in this book, Aikweyama reveals that class becomes a virtue, the ethical compass and the moral that every Ghanaian had to pursue got lost. The desire for honest living that pervaded traditional African communities, as Mbiti suggests, was severely eroded, alienating the pursuers of such ideals. And major characters in this book mourn the disappearance of values that were there before colonialism. So Nkrumah executes the colonial script even better. Sarah Gilani in 2019 observes that materialism is deeply entrenched in amas the Bitfans are not yet born, such that the acquisition of wealth becomes the fulcrum around which care and love are expressed, identity and recognition are reinforced. Given their poverty, the man and the teacher confront challenges in the interaction with the family and friends. Kumsun, the protagonist's former classmate, leads by example to inculcate the materialistic philosophy that alienates the poor in a way that is inconsistent with Nkrumah's promise. Because Nkrumah had promised that he will establish a society in which every Ghanaian will participate in the economic affairs of the nation. But taking over is like he makes it worse. And this one actually supports what Baba says, because it's like the mimic executes the script better than the original. So that the original class structure of colonialism is made worse during Nkrumah's era. For Baba, this is an imitation of the colonial structure executed to the extremes. The masses refer to Kumsun as my white man, yeah, and bread is all yours. As the singer urges him to buy groceries for his girlfriends, Amma 1968, page 43. If his fridges are full. At this point, Amma makes snide references to the sexual immorality that pervades the private lives of African dictators at independence. Teacher says the promise was so beautiful, and in the next section describes Nkrumah's speech of the promise. Nkrumah exhibits all attributes of great oratory, but his promise of freedom from the white man in Baba's theorization is questionable. Like many other Ghanaian immigrants, Teacher derides, 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 derides Teacher writes, Nkrumah had lived in the West possibly because of his fascination with white people's power. The promise of freedom is vague because, as an imitator, he is destitute of an African vision on which to establish an independent Ghana. Naivety is the prime cause of teachers' belief in Nkrumah's speeches. How different is Nkrumah from other victims of mimicry Teacher describes earlier? Yeah, so he had lived in the West for a long time before he came to Ghana to participate in politics. And when he comes, he does not bring any change. He does not have any original vision of Africa, for he does not embrace the philosophy of the African people. Yeah? Compare Nkrumah to leaders like Nelson Mandela, who lived in South Africa all his life. And because of that, he was ready even to die for his people, for he knew the pains, that the black people of South Africa were passing through. But Nkrumah had lived in the West, had trained as a Baptist preacher, and so when he comes, actually, he does not have the philosophy of the people to enable him craft a more serious Pan-Africanist vision to help Africa have its own system of government. So how could they understand that even those who have not been anywhere know that the black man who has spent his life fleeing from himself into whiteness has no power if the white master gives him none? Yeah? So the whole question of living in the West, admiring Western values, Amma suggests that it is the major cause of Nkrumah's failure, because he has always looked at Western culture as superior and better. Yeah? And so he cannot, Nkrumah as a mimic, does not have any ability, to come up with an original political structure to save Africa from poor governance. Yeah? Teachers' assertions resonate with Baba's argument that mimicry is a site for the colonizer's control over the colonized. And this is something that Amma is telling African leaders, that for them to come up with an original system of government, they need to do away with imitation. Taking a constitution from America and planting it in Kenya or in another African country does not solve African problems. African people need to sit down, study their traditional systems of government, study the current challenges they are passing through, and craft a political system relevant to the African situation. This is actually the substance of my paper. This is the substance of my paper. And this is what I've drawn from the thoughts of these great literary thinkers. So the constitutions they apply, are borrowed from the West such that they have scanty knowledge of their contents. Worse still was the propensity of a Pan-Africanist to stick to Western political practices without any thought of traditional African democracy where decisions were reached by consensus. Asamoah 2005 argues that in African democracies, decisions were reached by consensus, not by a binary concept called voting. So how democratic or Pan-African was Nkrumah? His political career exhibit what Baba's notion of confusion and failure. The British used divide and rule to establish colonial rule in Zimbabwe. So now let's look at, of course, um, um, uh, let's now look at Chikwava's North, yeah, how a mimicry, works here. So the British used divide and rule to establish colonial rule in Zimbabwe. Lobengula is conquered, then the Ndebele take advantage of their centralized government to obtain positions in the colonial government. That is Zembe 2015. And Robert Mugabe assumes power. He uses divide and rule tactics. That is Filmstar 2008. Yeah, Mugabe murders more than 20,000 members of the Ndebele society. So you can see the way Mugabe is acting is just the same way the British operated. There are certain tactics that Mugabe had actually borrowed, from the British, and this is what we are calling mimicry. A mimic is a reformed other, and he is likely to be more brutal because he executes a script from the colonizer even in a better way. Chikwava demonstrates strained relationships between the Zimbabwean migrants, possibly because of ethnic differences. When you look at Chikwava's work, the way the characters behave, immigrant characters behave in England, it shows the historical divisions of the Ndebele and the Shona during the colonial period. Zembe opines that marginalization of the Ndebele affects relationships among Zimbabwean migrants in England even today. Alec, one of the characters in Chikwava's North, exploits fellow immigrants who are possibly the Shona. He abandons the Shona partner Sisi and is very critical of Mugabe's regime. So Alec, this character is very critical of Mugabe's regime, and it suggests throughout the novel, that Alec is Ndebele. Mugabe exhibits Baba's theorization, with regard to confusion and ambivalence, in the mimic. After supporting the whites for more than 20 years, Mugabe changes his stance suddenly around 1998 and 2000, and suddenly orders them to leave Zimbabwe. So what are the potentialities of an Africanized system of governance in Mulwa's inheritance? So Mulwa's inheritance juxtaposes the potentialities of authentic African leadership with the mimics in the characters of Kutula and Laguna Kaso. So in this particular book now, in this play, Mulwa suggests that an Africanized system of government or African democracy is quite different from Western democracy. And it's like when you look at Kutula, his major character, Kutula, King Kutula, you see how an African leader is supposed to behave. So King Kutula 15 contends that despite introducing the material aspects of development, the whites denied Africans freedom, they alienated them from their land, and established a foreign system of government based on foreign values. So King Kutula does not want foreign values, which came to erode our ability to establish an African democracy. As the homegrown leader of Kutula, King Kutula 15 strives to set Kutula on an original path, which infuriates the colonizer to the extent that Menenja described him as the most dangerous person. Unlike Kumsun and the narrator in the two novels above, who dwell on mimicry, King Kutula identifies with the ways of his people, and he speaks to the Governor Mackay in proverbial English. Kutula's choice of African idiom reiterates Bugi's postulation on language as a colonial means of spiritual subjugation. According to Ngugi 1986, culture is indistinguishable from language, which makes possible its genesis, growth, and transmission from one generation to the next. To demonstrate reverence for African ways, King Kutula sustains a long conversation with a dozen proverbs, to Governor Mackay's astonishment. For instance, to express his yearning for Kutula's independence, he tells Mackay how the tortoise informed the elephant that though small it was, the compound was his. Page 10. Governor Mackay loses his nerve and blurts out, "This proverbial drivel leads us nowhere." As a testament to King Kutula's rejection of mimicry, which for Baba is the imitator's acceptance of a reformed and recognizable other. When we imitate so much, when we mimic so much, Africans, even a language going for native speaker competence, trying to twang around, we are just trying to accept that we are a reformed and recognizable other, which yields nothing other than failure. Africa, for example, we need to have our own language. We need an African language for our leaders to speak it when they meet Western leaders and other leaders on an international pedestal. We cannot just be imitators where our leaders now twang around in English and French. We are just trying to shame ourselves that we cannot have our own African civilization. It's good to learn other languages, but we also need to have our lingua franca, which other nations, foreigners can also learn for them to know that as Africa, we have our own civilization. King Kutula's original path enables him to introduce a political structure based on African values such as religion, sharing, and concern for others. BT 1970. King Kutula rejects Western imperialism and ensures equitable distribution of resources. Guided by honesty and love, Kutula prudently utilizes the resources of his nation without any propensity for embezzlement. He does not embezzle any funds. This greed we see in Africa today, that's what we saw in Nkrumah. Nkrumah in Aikwaya Mas, the pit funds are not yet born. We see out of greed, and Nkrumah basically was trying to imitate a material philosophy, materialistic philosophy from foreign cultures. So his religious ideals, that is King Kutula's religious ideals, demonstrates what Blyden argues. According to Blyden, the African personality is very different from the Western personality. For Blyden, the African personality is basically spiritual. And if there is a contribution that Africa will make to the world, according to Edward Blyden, it is more of a spiritual contribution, that the African personality is not very materialistic, and this is what we see in King Kutula in Mulwa's Inheritance. And we look at even his humility. Humility in the African situation is his leadership. And in King Kutula, we see a real African leader. Who is a real African? For those of you who have not read Mulwa's Inheritance, you need to read it for you to understand. The African personality. Look at King Kutula, and you will see the African philosophy of leadership. He lives a simple life. He lives a simple life. He drives a Volkswagen and refrains from borrowing. This question of borrowing, loans everywhere, it is not an African philosophy. African philosophy is not about loans. Yes. So like the colonialists, King Lacuna owns a mineral company where he exploits black workers. So his son, King Lacuna, of course, he kills his father, and takes over because of neo-colonial influence. But when you look at Lacuna, you see the Western philosophies and how they have failed Africa. That when we are mimics, we are just imitators, and sometimes we can imitate wrong things, wrong leadership, like Adolf Hitler, like Mussolini. That is the kind of leadership, because a mimic is just an imitator, and it will basically be worse. In fact, when you look at now, most European leaders are better because they are original, but African leaders are worse because they are mere imitators of what is there. Africa needs to sit down. Our political scientists need to look at our culture and see the political values of like look at Kenya. Look at the Kikuyu of Kenya. They were ruled by Mudamaki, and Mudamaki was basically a facilitator of discussion. He was not a chief decision maker. You look at the Kalenjin, they were ruled by a council of elders. And you find the seer or coyote, was just a facilitator of discussion. Building consensus was the major way through which decisions were made. And that's why in Kenya today, you find after every election, there must be some handshake to bring consensus. This one tells us that the system we have adopted is basically inconsistent to African values. We need to go back to our culture, sit down as political scientists, and incorporate some aspects of political leadership, political governance in the contemporary constitutions. Otherwise, we will be going against the way the African personality. So while colonists whip and murder Africans, Lacuna assassinates his father and demands Judas and Melo, his loyal party member, to kill his brother Bengo. So as Baba postulates, Lacuna executes the colonialist script to extremes. He borrows in the name of the people and banks in accounts abroad. He leases public land to imperialists after they fail to pay loans. He is also in love with Judas and Melo's daughter, Lulu, an underage girl. And then he locks her in the palace and makes advances at her. This is the same immorality we saw in Kumsun in The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, that a mimic will just be a reformed other, is more of a criminal that needs rehabilitation. And mostly we will end up imitating even the wrong things according to mimicry. And as much as people say that mimicry is a site of resistance, as Baba suggests, we must remember that mimicry and hybridity are also sites of alienation. And look at this is what Ngugi grapples with in this book, River Between. By Waiyaki adopting hybridity, at the end of the novel, he ends up failing to fight for the independence of his people. He ends up not achieving the vision that his ancestors laid because of mimicry and hybridity. So mimicry is also a site of alienation, and we need to be careful. As much as our great scholars like Fanon talked about existence of Western and African culture, coexistence of the two cultures, why are we basically imitating wrong things from foreign cultures? Why are we imitating only wrong things like dictatorship, like greed? Why can't we isolate? Because according to Ngugi's River Between, we need to pick, or Fanon, we need to pick good things from Western culture. Because Fanon in Wretched of the Earth talks about we taking good things from Western culture and good things from African culture. But how come we are just picking negative things like dictatorship, greed? Why are we just imitating Hitler, military regimes all over? Even as we talk about Burkina Faso, this question of military regimes, it was not part of African culture. It wasn't. So even for Burkina Faso, my advice is that Traore should talk to people so that they have an African form of democracy. Mandela talks about it, where decisions are made by consensus, not by military rules. And this is where now Traore cannot just be supporting Putin. We don't want dictators from the West. Dictatorship is not part of African philosophy. It is not. The African personality is sympathetic, empathetic, religious. Just look at Blyden, the way he studied African personality. And we should not just dismiss Blyden. Some scholars just say, oh, this man, Blyden, his ideas are now obsolete, but have we thought about them? Because he took a long time to study the African personality and wrote about it. So for Burkina Faso, they need to sit down and have an African democratic system of government based on consensus, not military rule. Marxist styles. Marxist was also a Western philosophy by Karl Marx. So we cannot just imitate Marxism. We need our own original philosophy. Sit down, talk to our own people, and have an African democracy. So of course, we are talking about Lacuna, a very, very bad example. So Lacuna, like Nkrumah, is overthrown at the end of Mulwa's inheritance. So what is my conclusion? What is our take home? So in the study, it was found that there was a semblance between tactics employed by the colonial administration and post-independent African leaders in the three selected texts. There was also a nexus between political failure and leaning toward Western culture or Western political systems among African leaders. Yeah? Nkrumah and Kumsun's mastery of Western language and culture just lead to failure. King Kutula's decision to shun blind imitation of Western imperialism in Mulwa's inheritance sets him on an admirable path by leading the citizens humanely. So this means if we have our African system of government, we are likely to lead people in a humane and in a better way. And as I've said, if we look at Mandela's long walk to freedom, he talks about his angle, who used to lead by consensus. And he says that in this particular system, almost everybody had to be listened to, that the leader would be criticized. But he did not see even one day when his angle got infuriated by criticism. Yeah, but he would listen to everyone. Yeah, and every elder had to come to a consensus before a decision was made. And using this book, I feel that African democracy is based on consensus, not on voting. And even as we take voting from the West, we need to come up with constitutions that also incorporate philosophies of our ancestors. Our philosophies, there is a way, they led their people, and we need to incorporate some of the ideas. We should not just pick ideas from the West and then lump them in Africa. And the more we imitate, and as we saw Sarah talking about imitation being a learning strategy for toddlers. Yeah. So there is need for African people to establish their own systems of governance. Yeah. And that's why King Utula had a better regime in Mulwa's inheritance. Otherwise, the rest of the people we have seen in this discussion, they did not have successful systems of governance. And we also need a language of our own. So thank you so much for listening to me. That is the end of my presentation.